The suitcase hit the floor with a heavy thud, and Claire Cole froze at the top of the stairs. Daniel stood in the hallway below, his coat already on, his car keys in his hand. He did not look nervous. He did not look sorry. He looked like a man who had already made his choice long before this moment. "I'm leaving," he said. "Tonight." Claire gripped the railing. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "Leaving for what? A trip? A meeting?" "I'm leaving you, Claire." The words landed like a slap. She came down the stairs slowly, her bare feet cold against the wood. "What are you talking about?" "We had dinner 2 hours ago. You asked me about my sister's visit. You kissed me before you left for your walk." "Her name is Lily," Daniel said, as if that explained everything. "She's 24. I've been seeing her for 8 months. Claire's stomach turned to ice. 8 months. Half a year and more of birthdays, holidays, quiet mornings, all of it a lie sitting quietly under the surface of her life. She thought of the nights he came home late, smelling faintly of perfume that she told herself was from the office. She thought of the phone he started keeping face down on the table. 8 months, she repeated, her voice flat now, stripped of feeling. "You've been lying to me for 8 months, and you're telling me like it's a weather report." "I didn't want to hurt you," Daniel said, and even he seemed to hear how empty that sounded. "You didn't want to hurt me, so you decided the kindest thing was to destroy our marriage in one sentence, after 15 years, while holding a suitcase you clearly already packed." Claire's hands were shaking now. She pressed them together to stop it. "When did you pack that? This morning? While I was at the grocery store?" He didn't answer. That silence told her everything. "You planned this," she said. "You planned this like a business trip. Did you tell your mother? Did you tell Lily you'd be home by midnight safe and sound, once you got the unpleasant part over with?" "Claire, please don't make this uglier than it needs to be." "Uglier?" A short, disbelieving laugh escaped her. "You are standing in the house we bought together, telling me you've had a secret life for almost a year, and you're asking me not to make it ugly?" Daniel picked up the suitcase. "I'll send someone for the rest of my things next week." "Next week." Claire folded her arms tightly across her chest, as if she could hold herself together by force. "So this really is happening, right now, tonight." "I think it's better this way, clean, quick." "Clean for you, maybe," she said quietly. "There's nothing clean about this for me." He walked to the door. His hand was on the handle when Claire spoke again, her voice steadier than she felt. "Does she know you left your wedding ring on the kitchen counter every single time you went to see her? Does she know that, or does she just know the version of you that shows up freshly showered and full of compliments?" Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't turn around. "Good night, Claire." The door closed. The sound of his car pulling out of the driveway faded into the night, and then the house was silent in a way it had never been silent before. Not peaceful. Empty. Claire stood in the hallway for a long time, staring at the space where he had been standing only minutes ago. She looked down and saw a small folded receipt on the floor, likely fallen from his coat pocket. She picked it up without thinking. A restaurant. A candlelit dinner, judging by the prices. Dated 3 days ago, the same night he told her he was working late. She sat down right there on the stairs, the receipt crumpled in her fist, and for the first time that night, she let herself cry. Not gentle tears. Deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere she didn't know existed inside her, a place that had been quietly breaking for 8 months without her permission. The house phone rang an hour later. It was Grace, her younger sister, calling for their usual Tuesday check-in, unaware that Claire's entire world had just shifted on its foundation. "Hey, is Daniel taking you out this weekend? Mom wants to know if—" Grace stopped mid-sentence. "Claire, are you crying?" Claire tried to speak and failed. She tried again. "He left me, Grace." There was a beat of stunned silence. "He what?" "He's been seeing someone. 8 months. A 24-year-old named Lily. He packed a bag and walked out 20 minutes ago like he was heading to a business conference." "I'm coming over," Grace said immediately, her voice sharp with fury. "Don't you dare touch anything of his. Don't clean up, don't fold his clothes, don't do a single thing for that man tonight." "I don't have the strength to do anything anyway," Claire whispered. "Good, save it, you're going to need it." Grace arrived within 20 minutes, still in her pajama pants with a coat thrown over them. She found Claire sitting exactly where she'd left her, on the stairs, staring blankly at the front door, as if Daniel might walk back through it and say it was all some terrible joke. Grace sat down beside her sister and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. She didn't say anything for a while. She just let Claire lean into her, let her shake, let her cry until there was nothing left to cry out. "I don't understand," Claire finally said. "I gave him everything. I supported him when he started his business." I stayed up with him through every bad deal and every stressful client. I put my own career on hold so he could travel for work, and he throws all of that away for someone who's barely older than the interns he used to complain about. Because he's a coward, Grace said flatly. A real man doesn't sneak around for 8 months and then walk out with a packed bag like he's escaping a burning building. He built himself an exit before he even told you there was a fire. Claire wiped her face with the back of her hand. What am I supposed to do now? This house, our accounts, everything is tangled up with him. I don't even know where half our money is. He handled all of it. Then tomorrow, we start untangling it, Grace said. Tonight, you just breathe. That's the only job you have tonight. But sleep never came for Claire. She lay in the bed they had shared for over a decade, staring at the ceiling, replaying the last 8 months in her mind like a film she hadn't known she was watching. The late nights, the sudden business trips that used to be rare and became frequent, the way he stopped reaching for her hand in public, the way his laughter, when he came home, sometimes carried the leftover warmth of someone else's company. She had noticed the small things. She had simply chosen not to look at them directly, the way a person avoids staring at the sun, even when they can feel its heat on their skin. Morning came gray and quiet. Claire moved through the kitchen like a stranger in her own home, making coffee out of habit rather than desire. Grace, who had stayed the night on the couch, joined her at the table. "You look terrible," Grace said gently. "Thank you," Claire replied, a small, tired smile flickering at the corner of her mouth despite everything. "I mean it kindly. You look like someone who didn't sleep and has every right not to have slept." Grace poured herself a cup. "What's the plan?" "I don't have one." "Then we make one, starting with the bank. You need to know exactly what's in every account, what bills are tied to what, and whether your name is even on half of this." Claire's hands tightened around her mug. The idea of stepping into that world, the world of accounts and lawyers and cold financial reality, felt like being asked to run a marathon the morning after breaking both legs. But some small, stubborn part of her, buried beneath the grief, recognized that Grace was right. "Okay," she said quietly. "Bank first." Grace reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You are not the first woman this has happened to, Claire. And you will not be the last woman to walk out the other side of it stronger than she went in. I promise you that." Claire didn't believe her yet. Not really. The pain was too fresh, too raw, sitting in her chest like a stone. But she held on to Grace's words anyway, the way a drowning person holds on to anything that floats. Later that morning, as Claire showered and dressed for the first time since the night before, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Her heart skipped, foolishly hoping it might be Daniel, some strange, twisted part of her still hungry for the apology that would never come. It wasn't Daniel. It was his mother, Margaret. "I heard what happened. I am so sorry, Claire. My son has always chased comfort over commitment, even as a boy. This is not who I raised him to become. If you need anything, please call me." Claire read the message twice, surprised by the flicker of warmth it gave her in the middle of so much cold. She didn't reply, not yet. She wasn't ready to talk about it with anyone connected to Daniel, even someone as kind as Margaret. But she saved the number, a small thread of comfort to hold on to for later. By the time Claire finally left the house that afternoon, dressed and composed on the outside even though she felt hollow within, she caught her reflection in the hallway mirror by the front door. A woman stared back at her with red-rimmed eyes and a straight spine. She did not know yet who that woman would become. She only knew she was not the same person Daniel had left behind the night before. Something in her, quiet but undeniable, had already begun to change. The bank sat on the corner of a street Claire had passed 1,000 times without ever really seeing it. Today it looked different, taller somehow, more intimidating, like a building that knew exactly how fragile she felt walking through its doors. Grace walked beside her, arms crossed, chin lifted, radiating the kind of protective anger that made Claire feel, for the first time in over 12 hours, like she wasn't standing completely alone. "Whatever they tell you in there," Grace said quietly as they approached the entrance, "you don't have to react to it right now. You can feel it later. Right now, you just gather the facts." Claire nodded, though her chest felt tight. She thought of Daniel's face the night before, calm and unbothered, already halfway out the door in his mind long before his body followed. She thought about how easily he had said goodnight, as if 15 years could be folded up and set aside like an old coat he no longer needed. She pushed open the glass door and stepped inside, unsure of what she would find, only certain that whatever it was, she would have to face it with her own 2 hands now. Nobody was coming to save her. She would have to save herself. The bank manager, a soft-spoken man named Peter, slid a folder across his desk with a look Claire recognized instantly, the careful, practiced sympathy of someone who had delivered bad news many times before. "I'm sorry to tell you this, Mrs. Cole, but the joint account was emptied 3 days ago. The mortgage account is still active, but the payment due this Friday hasn't been scheduled." Claire's fingers tightened around the arm of her chair. "Emptied? By who?" "The withdrawal was made by Daniel Cole. It's within his rights, as it's a joint account, but I understand this must come as a shock. 3 days ago, the same night as the restaurant receipt. He had taken their money before he even told her he was leaving, before he had even packed his bag. He had planned every piece of his exit with the same cold precision he used to close his business deals." "What about my personal savings?" Claire asked, forcing her voice to stay level. Peter checked his screen. "That account is untouched. It's solely in your name. A small mercy. Not much, but something." Claire exhaled slowly, feeling Grace's hand settle firmly on her shoulder from the chair beside her. "What are her options?" Grace asked, cutting straight to it. "For the mortgage, for the bills, for everything else tied to that house?" Peter explained slowly, patiently, laying out the pieces of a life Claire hadn't chosen to dismantle, but now had no choice but to face. Refinancing. Proof of income. A conversation with a lawyer about the house itself, since both their names were on the deed. Claire listened, nodding at the right moments, writing down numbers and terms in a small notebook Grace had thought to bring, though none of it truly felt real yet. It felt like she was listening to instructions for someone else's life. When they finally left the bank an hour later, the afternoon sun felt too bright, too ordinary for a day that had cracked her world in half. "You need a lawyer," Grace said as they walked to the car. "Today, if possible, before he has time to hide anything else. I don't even know where to start looking for one." "I do," Grace said. "My friend Emma went through something similar 2 years ago. She'll know someone good." By evening, Claire had a name and a number for a lawyer named Patricia Hughes, known, according to Emma, for being sharp, fair, and completely unimpressed by men who thought charm could replace honesty. Claire called and left a message, her voice steadier now than it had been that morning, though her hand still trembled slightly as she set the phone down. That night, alone in the house for the first time since Daniel left, Claire wandered from room to room, seeing everything with new eyes, the photographs on the mantel, smiling versions of a life that had quietly been a lie for the last 8 months. The armchair by the window where Daniel used to read his business reports, now sitting empty, strangely accusing in its stillness. She found herself in the guest room closet, pulling out an old box of things from before Daniel, before the marriage, before she had folded so much of herself into being his wife. Inside were sketchbooks from her 20s, half filled with drawings she had abandoned once she started supporting his career instead of her own art. She sat on the floor with the box in her lap, flipping through pages of a woman she barely recognized, a woman who once dreamed of things that had nothing to do with anyone else's ambitions. She didn't cry this time. She simply sat there, tracing the old pencil lines with her fingertip, feeling something stir quietly beneath the numbness, a memory of who she used to be, before she disappeared into being someone's wife. The following days blurred together in a haze of paperwork, phone calls, and carefully worded emails. Patricia Hughes turned out to be exactly as sharp as promised, walking Claire through the process of separating finances, securing the house temporarily, and preparing for whatever came next, whether that meant divorce proceedings or, though Claire doubted it, some kind of reconciliation. "Do you want to save the marriage?" Patricia asked bluntly during their second meeting. Claire thought about it for a long moment. She thought about the 8 months of lies, the restaurant receipt, the emptied account, the calm, unbothered way Daniel had said goodnight as he walked out the door. "No," she said finally, and the word surprised her with how solid it felt leaving her mouth. "I don't think I do." Patricia nodded, unsurprised. "Then let's focus on protecting what's yours, and building what comes next." Word of the separation spread quickly through their small social circle, the way news like that always does. Claire began to notice the shift in how people looked at her at the grocery store, the pharmacy, the coffee shop she used to visit with Daniel on weekends. Some eyes held pity. A few, she suspected, held quiet judgment, wondering what she must have done wrong to drive her husband into another woman's arms. She learned quickly to hold her head up regardless, refusing to shrink under the weight of other people's assumptions. One afternoon, at the small local market, she ran into an old neighbor, Diane, who greeted her with exaggerated sympathy that didn't quite mask the curiosity underneath. "Oh, Claire, I heard. How are you holding up?" "It must be so hard, especially with her being so young." Claire kept her voice light and even. I'm doing well, actually. Thank you for asking. Diane blinked, clearly expecting tears or bitterness rather than calm composure. Well, you're being very brave about it. I'm not being brave, Claire said simply. I'm just refusing to let someone else's choices decide how I live my life. She walked away from that conversation feeling something unfamiliar but welcome, a small flicker of strength she hadn't expected to find so soon. Grace continued checking in daily, sometimes staying over, sometimes simply calling to make sure Claire had eaten something more substantial than tea and toast. It was Grace who first mentioned the idea of Claire returning to work, not out of financial desperation alone, though that played a part, but as a way of reclaiming a piece of the identity she had set aside for so long. You used to be good at design, Grace reminded her one evening as they sat together on the porch, the evening air cool against their skin. Really good. Before you started managing every detail of Daniel's business instead of building your own. That was a long time ago, Claire said quietly. It doesn't have to stay in the past. Claire looked out at the darkening street, considering the idea for the first time without immediately dismissing it. A version of herself before Daniel. A version of herself that existed outside of being someone's wife. The next morning, driven by something she couldn't quite name, restlessness, curiosity, or perhaps the first genuine spark of hope since that terrible night on the stairs, Claire opened her old laptop and searched for local design firms hiring for junior or returning positions. Her hands hovered over the keyboard for a long moment before she finally began updating a resume that had sat untouched for over a decade. It felt strange, almost foreign, listing skills and experience that predated her entire marriage. But as she typed, something inside her chest loosened slightly, a small measure of breathing room in a life that had felt suffocating for days. She sent out 3 applications that afternoon, before she could talk herself out of it. Then she closed the laptop, sat back, and allowed herself, for the first time since Daniel walked out the door, to feel something other than grief. It was small, it was fragile, but it felt, unmistakably, like the first true step toward standing on her own 2 feet. 2 days later, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail, still wary of unknown callers after Margaret's unexpected text, but something made her answer. Is this Claire Cole? This is Naomi from Brightline Design Studio. We received your application and would love to bring you in for an interview this week, if you're available. Claire gripped the phone tightly, her heart pounding with something that felt suspiciously like hope. Yes, she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. I'm available. When the call ended, Claire sat quietly in her kitchen, staring at nothing in particular, and allowed herself a small, tentative smile. It wasn't happiness, not yet. The wound Daniel had left was still too raw for that. But it was something close to possibility, a door cracking open just slightly after days of feeling completely closed in. Grace arrived that evening to find Claire in the kitchen with 2 dresses laid out on the counter, deciding what to wear to an interview for the first time in over a decade. Look at you, Grace said, grinning as she leaned against the doorway. A week ago you couldn't get off the stairs, now you're planning outfits for job interviews. Don't get ahead of yourself, Claire said, though a small, genuine smile tugged at her lips. It's just an interview. It's a beginning, Grace corrected gently, and beginnings matter. Claire looked down at the dresses on the counter, feeling a strange mixture of fear and determination settle over her. She thought of Daniel, somewhere across town, likely wrapped up in his new life with Lily, probably not thinking of her at all. And for the first time since that terrible night, the thought didn't crush her the way she expected it to. Instead, it steadied her. Whatever came next, she would build it herself, brick by brick, without waiting for anyone's permission or apology. She picked up the blue dress, held it against herself in the mirror, and nodded once, quietly, to the woman staring back at her. It was time to begin again. The interview at Brightline Design Studio took place on a bright Thursday morning, and Claire arrived 20 minutes early, sitting in her car outside the building, gripping the steering wheel while she rehearsed answers to questions she hadn't been asked in over a decade. Naomi, the woman who had called her, turned out to be warm and direct, with sharp eyes that seemed to see straight through nerves to the person underneath. She reviewed Claire's old portfolio, faded but still striking, sketches and layouts from a career Claire had paused to support someone else's dreams. These are strong, Naomi said, flipping through the worn pages. Why did you stop? Claire hesitated, unsure how much to share. Life got in the way, she finally said. My husband's business needed a lot of support. I told myself I would come back to this eventually. And now? Now feels like the right time, Claire said, and she meant it more than she expected to. Naomi studied her for a long moment before smiling. We have an opening for a junior designer. It's not glamorous work at first, mostly supporting senior staff, learning our systems. But if you're serious about rebuilding, I think you'd do well here. Claire left the studio that day with a job offer in hand, and a strange, unfamiliar lightness in her chest. The first real lightness she had felt since the night Daniel walked out with his packed suitcase and calm goodbye. She started the following Monday, nervous and out of practice but determined. The first few days felt overwhelming, filled with new software, new terminology, and colleagues half her age who moved through design programs with an ease she had to relearn from scratch. But by the end of the first week, something inside her had shifted. She came home tired in a way that felt earned rather than hollow, her mind occupied with color palettes and client briefs instead of replaying the night Daniel left on an endless loop. Meanwhile, across town, life inside Daniel and Lily's new apartment looked far different from the picture Daniel had painted in his mind when he packed that suitcase. The apartment itself was sleek and modern, chosen entirely by Lily, who had strong opinions about everything from the color of the curtains to the brand of coffee they kept in the cupboard. Daniel found himself adjusting to a version of domestic life that felt strangely unfamiliar, despite having lived with a partner for 15 years before this. "You're doing that thing again," Lily said one evening, not looking up from her phone as Daniel set the table for dinner. "What thing?" "That thing where you fold the napkins like we're hosting a formal dinner." "It's just us, Daniel, relax." Daniel glanced down at the neatly folded napkins, a habit born from years of a certain kind of domestic order, and felt an odd flicker of embarrassment, as if he had done something foolish rather than simply careful. "Sorry," he muttered, unfolding them into a more casual pile. Small moments like that had begun accumulating since he moved in with Lily. Tiny corrections and comments that individually meant nothing but together painted a picture Daniel wasn't quite ready to examine too closely. Lily wasn't unkind, not exactly, but she carried an impatience with the ordinary rhythms of daily life that Claire had never shown, an eagerness for excitement that made quiet evenings at home feel, to her, like wasted time. "Can we go out tonight?" Lily asked, setting her phone down at last. "I don't want to just sit here eating pasta again." "I thought we could relax for once," Daniel said. "It's been a long week." "It's always a long week with you," Lily said, though she said it lightly, almost teasingly. "You used to be more spontaneous." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. He thought, unwillingly, of Claire, of quiet dinners at their kitchen table where conversation had never felt like a performance, where comfortable silence had never once felt like something to escape from. He pushed the thought away quickly, unwilling to examine it further. They went out that night, to a loud restaurant Lily had seen recommended online, filled with young couples and blaring music that made real conversation nearly impossible. Daniel smiled through most of the evening, nodding along to Lily's stories about coworkers and social media trends he barely understood, feeling, for reasons he couldn't quite name, strangely tired by the end of it. Back at Claire's house, unaware of any of this, life had settled into a new and steadier rhythm. Work occupied her days, filling hours that used to be consumed by worry and grief. In the evenings, she began sketching again, not for clients yet, simply for herself, rediscovering a joy in creating something without needing anyone's approval first. Grace visited less frequently now, not because she cared any less, but because Claire needed her less desperately than before. Their visits shifted from crisis management to something closer to genuine friendship, sisters sharing wine on the porch and laughing about small, ordinary things. "You seem lighter," Grace observed one evening, watching Claire flip through a sketchbook filled with new designs. "I feel lighter," Claire admitted, surprised by how true the words felt. "I didn't expect that. I thought I'd feel broken for a lot longer." "You were broken," Grace said gently. "For a while, you were completely shattered, but you didn't stay there. That matters more than people realize." Claire thought about that for a moment, tracing the edge of her sketchbook with her finger. "I keep waiting for the anger to hit harder, or the sadness to come back stronger. But mostly I just feel busy, focused, like I don't have time to fall apart anymore." "Maybe that's healing," Grace offered. "Maybe it doesn't always look like some big dramatic breakthrough. Maybe sometimes it just looks like getting up and going to work and coming home and being okay." Claire smiled softly at that, letting the thought settle over her like a warm blanket. Weeks passed. Claire's confidence at work grew steadily, her ideas increasingly trusted by senior staff who had initially viewed her as simply the quiet new hire filling an entry-level role. She began contributing real ideas to client projects, her instincts sharpened by years of managing complex situations. even if those years had been spent supporting someone else's career rather than her own. One afternoon, Naomi called her into the main office, a rare summons that made Claire's stomach twist with nervous anticipation. "We're bringing on a new client next month," Naomi explained. "A boutique hotel chain looking for a complete rebrand. I'd like you on the project team." Claire blinked, momentarily stunned. "Me? I've only been here a few months." "You've been here long enough for me to see you're wasted on basic support work," Naomi said simply. "Your instincts are good, Claire. Better than good. It's time you started using them properly." Claire left that meeting walking taller than she had in years, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval and everything to do with her own quiet, growing pride. That evening, she treated herself to a small celebration, dinner alone at a cafe she used to pass by without ever stopping, ordering whatever she wanted without needing to consider anyone else's preferences first. She sat by the window, watching the evening crowd move past, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely content in her own company. Across town, that same week, cracks in Daniel and Lily's relationship had begun widening into something harder to ignore. Lily had grown increasingly distant, her attention often absorbed by her phone, her responses to Daniel's questions growing shorter and more distracted. "Is everything okay?" Daniel asked one night, watching her scroll through messages with unusual intensity. "Fine," Lily said, not looking up. "Just work stuff." Daniel wasn't entirely convinced, but he let it go, unwilling to push further into territory that felt, increasingly, like unstable ground. He thought sometimes, in quiet moments he didn't like to examine too closely, of how easy conversation used to feel with Claire, how she never made him feel like he was competing with a screen for her attention. He shook the thought away each time it surfaced, telling himself the comparison was unfair, that every relationship required adjustment, that this restlessness was simply the natural texture of something new rather than something troubling. But late one night, unable to sleep, he found himself scrolling through old photographs on his phone, pausing on pictures from years earlier, holidays and quiet weekends with Claire that he had once, in the haze of new excitement, convinced himself meant less than they actually had. He stared at one photo in particular, the two of them laughing at some forgotten joke, her head tilted back, eyes crinkled with genuine, easy happiness. He closed the phone quickly, unsettled by the tightness that had formed in his chest, and told himself it was simply nostalgia, nothing more. Meanwhile, Claire's world continued expanding in ways she hadn't anticipated. Through a colleague at the design studio, she was introduced to a small community art class held on weekend mornings, a casual group of hobbyists and semi-professionals who gathered simply for the joy of creating without pressure or deadline. It was there, several weeks into her new routine, that she first noticed a man named Ethan, quiet and unassuming, sitting near the back of the room with a sketchbook of his own, his focus entirely absorbed in his work, rather than in socializing with the group around him. They didn't speak that first day, or even the second, but by the third week, when Claire found herself short on charcoal pencils, it was Ethan who quietly slid his own supply across the table without being asked, offering a small, easy smile that held none of the performative charm Claire had grown wary of in men. "Thank you," she said, genuinely surprised by the simple kindness. "No problem," Ethan replied. "I always bring extra. People forget things." It was such a small moment, so unremarkable on its surface, and yet something about the quiet, unassuming ease of it stayed with Claire long after the class ended that day. She found herself thinking about it later that evening, not with any particular romantic weight, simply with a soft curiosity about a man who seemed entirely comfortable existing without needing attention or validation from anyone around him. She didn't know yet how significant that small kindness would become. She only knew, walking home that afternoon under a sky painted gold with early evening light, that something inside her, some small and stubborn seed of hope, had quietly begun to grow again. For the first time since the night Daniel packed his suitcase and walked out the door, Claire felt something closer to whole than broken. And she intended to keep building from there, one steady day at a time, with or without anyone else's presence in her story. Weeks turned into a comfortable rhythm at the Saturday art class, and Claire found herself looking forward to those mornings more than she expected to. There was something grounding about the quiet scratch of pencils on paper, the low hum of conversation around her, and, increasingly, the easy presence of Ethan at the table beside her. He never pushed for conversation, never filled silence just to avoid discomfort the way some people did. When he spoke, it was usually simple and direct, observations about light or shadow, questions about her work rather than his own. Claire found the lack of performance oddly refreshing after years of managing Daniel's need for constant validation and attention. "You always draw houses," Ethan observed one Saturday, glancing at her sketchbook. "Empty ones, no people in the windows." Claire looked down at her page, slightly startled by the accuracy of his observation. She hadn't noticed the pattern herself, but there it was, sketch after sketch of quiet houses with dark, empty windows. "I hadn't realized that," she admitted. "Might mean something," Ethan said lightly, though his eyes held a gentler curiosity than the comment suggested. "Or might not. I once drew nothing but bridges for a whole year. Never figured out what that meant either." Claire laughed, surprised by how easily it came. "What do you draw now?" "Mostly trees," he said. "I like things that keep growing even after they've been cut back." Something about that answer settled quietly in Claire's chest, though she didn't examine it too closely in the moment. She simply nodded and returned to her sketch, aware of a small, comfortable warmth sitting beside her that had nothing to do with romance, not yet, but everything to do with feeling safe. Over the following weeks, their conversations grew longer, extending past the end of class into coffee at the small shop down the street. Claire learned that Ethan worked as a carpenter, building furniture by hand in a small workshop behind his house, a craft he had taken up after leaving a corporate job that had left him feeling hollow despite its comfortable salary. "I wanted to make something real," he told her one afternoon, turning his coffee cup slowly between his hands. "Something I could point to and say, 'I built that, with my own hands, start to finish.'" "That's a rare thing," Claire said. "Most people just want more, bigger, faster. You wanted simpler." "Simpler isn't always easier," Ethan said, "but it's usually more honest." Claire thought about that word, honest, and felt the familiar ache of Daniel's betrayal stir briefly in her chest, before settling again, quieter than it used to be. She hadn't told Ethan much about her marriage yet, only the basic facts, that she was recently separated, that it hadn't ended well. He hadn't pushed for more, respecting the boundary without needing to be told twice. It was during their fourth coffee together that Claire finally opened up more fully, the words coming slowly at first and then in a steady, unburdening flow. "He left for someone younger," she said, staring down at the table rather than at Ethan's face. 8 months of lying before he finally told me. Packed a suitcase like he was heading out for a business trip. Ethan was quiet for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle before responding. "That must have taken everything out of you." "It did, for a while," Claire admitted. "But I think I'm finding my way back." "You seem like you are," Ethan said gently. "You draw houses with empty windows, but you laugh easily, and you show up every Saturday determined to make something new." "That doesn't sound broken to me." Claire looked up at him then, meeting his steady, unhurried gaze, and felt something shift quietly inside her chest, a small crack of light breaking through walls she had built carefully over the past several months. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not treating me like something fragile." "You're not fragile," Ethan said simply. "You're rebuilding. That's different." Meanwhile, across town, the fragile structure Daniel and Lily had built together continued crumbling in small, steady increments. Lily's attention drifted further with each passing week, her responses growing sharper, her patience thinner, until even simple conversations began to feel like navigating unstable ground. "You never used to be this quiet," Lily said one evening, watching Daniel prepare dinner in silence. "I'm just tired," Daniel said, though the truth ran deeper than simple exhaustion. He had begun to notice, with growing discomfort, how often he found himself comparing this life to the one he had left behind, how the comparisons rarely favored where he currently stood. "You're always tired lately," Lily said, an edge creeping into her voice. "This isn't what I thought this would be like." "What did you think it would be like?" Daniel asked, genuinely curious despite the tension building between them. Lily hesitated, then shrugged, a gesture that somehow felt more damning than any explanation could have been. "I don't know, more exciting, I guess. You used to make everything feel like an adventure, sneaking around, planning secret dinners, all of it felt thrilling. Now it just feels like a regular relationship," Daniel finished quietly. "Yeah," Lily admitted. "Like a regular, boring relationship." The words stung more than Daniel expected, not because he disagreed exactly, but because he recognized with sudden and uncomfortable clarity that the excitement Lily had loved about their relationship had never been about him at all. It had been about the secrecy, the stolen moments, the thrill of something forbidden. Now that the forbidden had become simply ordinary, the thrill had evaporated, leaving behind two people who, Daniel realized with growing unease, might not actually know each other very well at all. That night, long after Lily had fallen asleep beside him, Daniel lay awake staring at the ceiling, his mind drifting uninvited toward memories he had spent months trying to keep at bay. Claire's laugh, the way she used to leave small notes in his briefcase before important meetings, the comfortable, easy silence they used to share on Sunday mornings, reading separate books in the same room, needing no conversation to feel connected. He hadn't realized, until this exact moment, how much of that quiet steadiness he had taken for granted, how easily he had mistaken comfort for boredom, familiarity for something lesser than the electric excitement he had chased with Lily. He pushed the thoughts away, telling himself it was simply late-night doubt, the kind everyone experienced occasionally. But the thought lingered, uninvited and persistent, refusing to fully release its grip on him. Back in Claire's world, life continued its steady upward climb. The hotel rebranding project at work had become a genuine passion for her, occupying her mind in ways that felt fulfilling rather than draining. She found herself staying late some evenings, not out of obligation but out of genuine enthusiasm for the work itself, a feeling she had nearly forgotten was possible. Her relationship with Ethan, meanwhile, deepened slowly and steadily, never rushed, never pressured. He invited her to his workshop one afternoon, proud in a quiet, understated way, as he showed her the pieces of furniture he had built by hand. A dining table with careful, precise joints, a rocking chair with smooth, curved arms worn soft from sanding. "This is beautiful," Claire said, running her hand along the surface of the table, genuinely impressed by the craftsmanship. "Took me 3 months," Ethan said. "Made a lot of mistakes along the way. Had to start over twice. But you didn't give up. No point starting something if you're not willing to fix your mistakes," Ethan said simply. "That's true of furniture, probably true of most things." Claire understood the deeper meaning behind his words without needing further explanation, and something about the quiet steadiness of his character settled comfortably alongside the growing confidence she had built in herself over the past several months. It was there, in his workshop, surrounded by the smell of fresh wood and the golden afternoon light filtering through dusty windows, that Ethan finally asked, carefully and without pressure, if she might like to have dinner with him, not as friends from art class, but as something more intentional. Claire considered the question seriously, aware of how far she had come since that terrible night on the stairs, aware of how much stronger she felt now than she had felt in years, even during the better parts of her marriage. "Yes," she said finally, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "I would like that very much." Ethan smiled back, warm and unhurried, and reached for her hand, holding it gently rather than possessively, a small gesture that somehow felt more meaningful than every grand romantic promise Daniel had ever made during the early years of their marriage. Claire left the workshop that evening feeling lighter than she had and longer than she could remember. Walking home under a sky painted with the soft colors of early evening, her heart cautiously, quietly opening itself to the possibility of something new. She thought, briefly, of Daniel, of the life he had chosen instead of her, and found, to her genuine surprise, that the thought no longer carried the same sharp sting it once had. It simply existed, a fact of her past, rather than a wound still actively bleeding. She was building something new now, brick by careful brick, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt genuinely excited about what still lay ahead. The end, when it finally came for Daniel and Lily, arrived without much drama, which somehow felt worse to Daniel than a dramatic confrontation might have. He came home from work one evening, to find half the closet empty, Lily's belongings already loaded into boxes stacked neatly by the front door. "What is this?" he asked, though the answer was obvious enough. "I met someone," Lily said, not bothering to soften the blow. "His name is Marcus. He's a photographer. We've been talking for a few weeks now." Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, an uncomfortable and unfamiliar feeling settling over him, the strange, disorienting sensation of standing exactly where Claire had once stood, receiving news that arrived with the same casual cruelty he himself had once delivered. "A few weeks," he repeated slowly. "So while you were telling me things felt boring, you were already talking to someone else." Lily shrugged, zipping up one of the boxes with practiced efficiency. "I didn't plan it, it just happened. Isn't that basically what you told your wife?" The comparison landed like a blow to the chest, sharp and undeniable. Daniel opened his mouth to argue, to point out the difference between an 8-month affair and a few weeks of texting, but the words died before they reached his tongue. There was no meaningful difference, not really. Both were betrayals dressed up in convenient excuses. "I hope he treats you well," Daniel finally said quietly, without bitterness, only a strange, hollow exhaustion. "I hope you figure yourself out," Lily replied, Not unkindly, simply honestly. You spent our whole relationship comparing me to someone you clearly still think about. Daniel wanted to deny it, but the words caught in his throat, refusing to form into a convincing lie. Lily left within the hour, the apartment suddenly feeling far too large and far too silent around him. He sat down on the couch amid the empty spaces where her belongings used to be, and stared blankly at the wall, replaying the last several months of his life, with a clarity he had been avoiding for far too long. He had left a steady, honest marriage for the thrill of secrecy, only to discover that the thrill had never truly belonged to him. It had belonged to the excitement of doing something forbidden, and once the forbidden became ordinary, there had been nothing solid left underneath to hold the relationship together. Days passed in a blur of quiet, uncomfortable reflection. Daniel found himself unable to fully process how quickly everything had unraveled, how the life he had once been so certain would bring him happiness had instead left him feeling more alone than he had ever felt during even the most stressful years of his marriage to Claire. He thought about calling her. He told himself repeatedly that it would be a mistake, that too much time had passed, that whatever damage he had caused could not simply be undone with a phone call. But the thought persisted, growing louder with each passing day, until finally, nearly 3 weeks after Lily left, he found himself sitting in his car outside the house that used to be theirs, staring at the front door with a mixture of hope and dread churning uncomfortably in his stomach. He hadn't called ahead. He wasn't entirely sure what he intended to say when the door opened, if it opened at all. He simply knew he needed to see her, needed to understand whether any part of what they had built together over 15 years might still exist, waiting patiently beneath the wreckage he had created. He knocked, and after a long moment that felt far longer than it likely was, the door opened. Claire stood there, and Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat. She looked different somehow, not older or worn down the way he had half expected, but brighter, steadier, carrying herself with a quiet confidence he didn't remember from before. Her hair was different, her posture straighter, and there was something in her eyes, a calm clarity, that hadn't been there in the final years of their marriage. "Daniel," she said, her voice even, neither warm nor cold. "What are you doing here?" "Can we talk?" he asked, his earlier confidence faltering under the weight of her steady gaze. Claire hesitated, glancing briefly over her shoulder into the house behind her, before stepping outside and closing the door partially behind her. "I have a few minutes." "I made a mistake," Daniel said, the words tumbling out faster than he intended, months of quiet reflection finally spilling over. "Leaving you. All of it. It was a mistake. Lily left me for someone else. I understand now what I threw away." Claire listened quietly, her expression unreadable, and for a moment Daniel allowed himself a fragile flicker of hope. "I'm sorry it didn't work out for you," she said finally, and though her tone held no cruelty, it also held no invitation. "But I'm not the same person I was when you left, Daniel." "I know that," he said quickly. "I can see that. You look incredible, honestly, stronger. I want to understand you again, Claire. I want to earn back what I threw away." Before Claire could respond, the front door opened behind her, and Ethan stepped out, a light jacket draped over his arm, clearly on his way somewhere with her. He paused when he saw Daniel standing on the porch, his expression calm and unbothered, though his eyes carried a quiet, protective awareness as he moved to stand slightly beside Claire. "Everything okay?" Ethan asked gently, his gaze steady on Daniel without hostility, simply steady attention. "This is Daniel," Claire said simply, "my ex-husband." Understanding flickered across Ethan's face, though his composure never wavered. "Ethan," he offered, extending a hand toward Daniel, who shook it automatically, his mind still catching up with the reality unfolding in front of him. Daniel looked between the two of them, the easy, comfortable closeness evident in the small distance between their shoulders. In the familiar way Ethan's hand found the small of Claire's back, protective without being possessive. The realization settled over him slowly, heavily, that whatever chapter had existed for him to return to had already closed, replaced by something new and steady that he had no place within. "I should let you two go," Daniel said quietly, his earlier hope deflating into something closer to quiet acceptance. "Take care of yourself, Daniel," Claire said, and she meant it, without bitterness, without cruelty, simply a genuine, distant wish for his well-being that carried none of the desperate longing he had hoped to find. Daniel nodded, turning to walk back toward his car, feeling the weight of everything he had lost settle fully onto his shoulders for the first time since the night he had packed that suitcase with such careless confidence. He glanced back once, watching Claire and Ethan walk together toward Ethan's truck, her laugh carrying faintly across the yard at something he said, easy and genuine in a way Daniel hadn't heard from her in years, not even during the better parts of their marriage. He drove home that evening to an empty apartment that no longer felt like anything resembling a home, and sat once again on the couch amid the quiet, turning over the events of the last several months with a clarity that felt, finally, painfully honest. He had chosen excitement over steadiness, novelty over depth, and in doing so, he had lost something he hadn't fully understood the value of until it was standing on a porch, glowing with a happiness that no longer had anything to do with him. Meanwhile, Claire climbed into Ethan's truck, settling into the passenger seat with a small, contented sigh. "You handled that well," Ethan said, starting the engine. "I've had practice," Claire said, a wry smile touching her lips. "Handling difficult conversations, I mean. 15 years of marriage teaches you a few things. Did it bother you, seeing him again?" Claire considered the question seriously before answering, checking in with herself rather than offering an automatic response. "A little," she admitted. "Old habits, old feelings, they don't disappear completely overnight. But it didn't shake me the way I thought it might." "That's growth," Ethan said simply. "Maybe," Claire said, looking out the window as familiar streets passed by. "Or maybe I've just finally figured out what actually matters to me." Ethan reached over, taking her hand gently in his, and Claire let him, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers, steady and unhurried, so different from the anxious, performative affection she had grown used to during the final years of her marriage. "Where are we headed tonight?" she asked, though she suspected, from the direction he was driving, that she already knew. "Thought we'd have dinner at my place," Ethan said. "Nothing fancy, just something simple." "Simple sounds perfect," Claire said, and she meant it fully, without reservation, aware of how far she had traveled from the woman who had once believed simple meant boring, who had once mistaken excitement and secrecy for genuine love. She had learned, over these past several months, that real love didn't require drama or secrecy to prove itself. It simply required honesty, steadiness, and the quiet, consistent choice to show up, day after day, without needing grand gestures to validate its worth. As the truck pulled into Ethan's driveway, Claire glanced briefly at her phone, half expecting some final message from Daniel, some last attempt at reconciliation. There was nothing, and for the first time since that terrible night on the stairs so many months ago, the absence of his presence in her life felt not like a wound, but like freedom. She stepped out of the truck into the cool evening air, Ethan's hand finding hers naturally as they walked toward his front door together, and allowed herself, fully and without hesitation, to step forward into the life she had built for herself. A life that no longer needed Daniel's approval, his presence, or his return to feel complete. It was, quite simply, already whole. 3 weeks after that unexpected visit to the porch, Daniel called Claire for the first time since she had watched him drive away, his headlights disappearing into the evening. She almost didn't answer, staring at his name on the screen for several long seconds before finally accepting the call, more out of curiosity than any lingering hope. "Claire, please, just give me a chance to explain properly," he said, his voice carrying a rawness she hadn't heard from him before, not even during the worst arguments of their marriage. "I know I don't deserve it, I know that, but I need you to understand how much I regret everything." Claire sat quietly on her porch, the same porch where he had stood weeks earlier, watching the evening settle gently over the neighborhood. "I'm listening," she said, her voice calm and even. "I threw away 15 years for something that turned out to be worth nothing," Daniel said, his words spilling out in a rush he seemed unable to control. "I was selfish. I convinced myself that excitement mattered more than everything you and I built together. I was wrong, Claire. I was so wrong, and I understand now what I lost." "You lost me because you chose to lose me," Claire said quietly, without cruelty, simply stating a truth she had come to accept fully over the past several months. "You didn't stumble into that decision, Daniel. You planned it. You packed a bag while I was still asking about your day." "I know," he admitted, his voice heavy with genuine regret. "I've thought about that night more times than I can count. I keep replaying it, wishing I had done anything differently." "But you didn't," Claire said, "and I'm not the same person who was standing in that hallway anymore. I've built something new since then, something honest and steady. I'm not interested in going backward." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and Claire could almost picture him sitting somewhere quiet, absorbing the finality of her words. "Is it because of him?" Daniel finally asked. "Ethan, it's because of me," Claire said firmly. Ethan is a wonderful part of my life now, but this isn't about replacing you with someone else. This is about me choosing myself, finally. After years of putting everyone else's needs ahead of my own, I'm not willing to give that up. Not for you, not for anyone. I understand, Daniel said quietly, and for the first time Claire believed he genuinely did understand, that the lesson had finally landed somewhere deep enough to matter, even if it had come far too late to change anything between them. I hope you find peace, Daniel, Claire said gently. I mean that sincerely, but I've found mine, and it doesn't include you anymore. Goodbye, Claire, he said softly, and this time, unlike the calm, dismissive goodnight he had offered months earlier while walking out the door, his voice carried the full weight of genuine loss. Goodbye, Daniel, Claire replied, and ended the call, setting her phone down on the small table beside her chair. She sat there for several minutes afterward, watching the last light of evening fade slowly into dusk, allowing herself to feel whatever emotions rose to the surface. There was a small ache, unavoidable given everything they had once shared, but beneath it sat something far stronger, a steady, unshakable sense of peace that had nothing to do with Daniel at all. Ethan found her there a short while later, settling into the chair beside her without needing to ask what had happened. He seemed to understand, in the quiet way he understood most things about her, that some moments needed space rather than questions. You okay? He finally asked, once the silence had stretched comfortably between them. I am, Claire said, and meant it completely. He called, wanted another chance. And I told him no, Claire said simply. Not out of anger, just clarity. That chapter is finished. Ethan reached over, taking her hand gently, and they sat together in comfortable silence as the stars began appearing overhead, one by one, scattered across the darkening sky. I used to think happiness meant everything going according to plan, Claire said after a while, thinking out loud rather than directing the words specifically at Ethan. The perfect marriage, the perfect house, the perfect life everyone could see and admire from the outside. And now? Ethan asked. Now I think happiness means being honest about who you actually are, and building a life around that honesty instead of around appearances. Claire turned to look at him, a soft, genuine smile spreading across her face. You taught me that, without even really trying to. I didn't teach you anything, Ethan said, smiling back at her. You figured it out yourself. I just happened to be sitting nearby when you did. Claire laughed softly, leaning her head against his shoulder, feeling entirely at peace in a way she hadn't believed possible during those first devastating weeks after Daniel left. Over the following months, life continued its steady, comfortable rhythm. Claire's career at Brightline Design Studio flourished, the hotel rebranding project earning praise from clients and colleagues alike, opening doors to larger projects and greater responsibility. She found herself, increasingly, mentoring newer designers at the studio, sharing not just technical skills but the quiet confidence she had rebuilt so painstakingly over the past year. Her relationship with Ethan deepened steadily, without drama, without the anxious highs and lows that had once defined her understanding of romantic love. They built something together slowly, brick by careful brick, much like the furniture Ethan crafted in his workshop, sturdy and lasting rather than flashy and temporary. One Saturday morning, nearly a year after that terrible night on the stairs, Claire returned to the art class where she and Ethan had first met, sketchbook in hand, settling into her usual seat near the back of the room. She glanced down at her latest sketch, a house with warm, glowing windows, figures visible inside, and smiled quietly at how far she had traveled since those early months of drawing empty houses with dark, lifeless windows. Grace visited that afternoon, as she often did, settling onto the porch with a bottle of wine and an easy smile that had become a familiar comfort in Claire's life. You look happy, Grace observed, watching her sister pour 2 glasses. I am happy, Claire said, and the simplicity of the statement carried the full weight of everything she had rebuilt since that devastating night, genuinely, fully happy, not performing it for anyone, just happy. You earned it, Grace said, raising her glass slightly. Every bit of it. Claire thought back over the past year, the shattered nights on the stairs, the terrifying uncertainty of the bank meetings, the small, stubborn courage it had taken to update a decade-old resume, the quiet kindness of a stranger offering charcoal pencils across a table. Each small step had led her here, to this porch, this glass of wine, this life she had built entirely on her own terms. Do you ever think about him? Grace asked gently. Daniel, I mean. Sometimes, Claire admitted honestly. Not often, and not with the pain I used to feel. Mostly I just think about how strange it is that losing him was actually the beginning of finding myself. That's not strange, Grace said softly. That's just how some stories work. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you ends up being the door to something better. Claire smiled, looking out at the quiet evening settling over her yard, the same yard where Daniel had once stood on the porch, hoping for a second chance she had no interest in giving him. She felt no bitterness toward that memory anymore, simply a quiet, grateful acknowledgement of how far she had come since that painful night. Later that evening, after Grace left and the house grew quiet, Ethan arrived for dinner, carrying a small wooden box he had made himself, presenting it to her with the same quiet, unassuming confidence that had first drawn her to him months earlier. "What's this?" Claire asked, turning the box over gently in her hands, admiring the careful craftsmanship. "Open it," Ethan said simply. Inside, nestled on a small cushion of soft fabric, sat a delicate ring, simple and elegant, entirely unlike the more elaborate ring Daniel had once presented with far more fanfare and far less genuine feeling. "Claire," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the visible nervousness in his eyes, "I don't need grand gestures to prove how I feel about you. I just need you, steady and honest, for as long as you'll have me. Will you marry me?" Claire looked up from the ring, meeting his eyes, feeling the full weight of everything she had survived and everything she had built settle comfortably around her like a warm embrace. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain, without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely, yes." Ethan slid the ring onto her finger, his hands gentle and sure, and pulled her into a warm embrace that held none of the anxious uncertainty her marriage to Daniel had carried during even its best moments. Standing there in her own kitchen, in the home she had rebuilt entirely on her own terms, Claire felt, fully and completely, that she had finally found the life she had always deserved, one built on honesty, steadiness, and genuine partnership rather than fleeting excitement and secret betrayal. Somewhere across town, Daniel sat alone in his apartment, still learning to navigate the quiet consequences of choices he could never fully undo. His story continued forward too, in its own uncertain way, but it no longer intersected with Claire's, no longer held any power over the life she had chosen to build. Claire's story, meanwhile, moved forward with quiet, steady confidence, filled not with the desperate hope of winning someone back, but with the genuine, hard-earned peace of a woman who had learned, through everything she survived, exactly what she was capable of building on her own. And that, she realized, standing in Ethan's arms with a new ring on her finger and an entire future stretching hopefully ahead of her, was worth infinitely more than anything she had lost the night Daniel walked out the door with his suitcase and his calm, careless goodbye. She had not simply survived his betrayal. She had transformed it into the beginning of everything good that came after. The wedding took place the following spring, in the backyard of the small house Claire and Ethan had bought together. A modest home with a wide porch and a garden Claire had planted herself over the winter months, determined to see something grow from her own two hands. Grace stood beside her sister as maid of honor, adjusting the simple, elegant dress Claire had chosen without a hint of the anxious perfectionism that had defined her first wedding so many years earlier. There were no elaborate arrangements, no worry over impressing distant relatives or business associates. Just close friends, a handful of family, and the quiet certainty that this, finally, was the right choice. "Nervous?" Grace asked, straightening the small flowers woven through Claire's hair. "Not even a little," Claire said, and she meant it fully. "I've never felt more certain of anything in my life." Margaret, Daniel's mother, had reached out weeks earlier, asking gently if she might attend, not to represent her son in any way, but simply because she had grown genuinely fond of Claire over the years and wanted to witness her happiness firsthand. Claire had agreed without hesitation, touched by the older woman's continued kindness even after everything that had happened. "You look radiant," Margaret said, embracing Claire warmly before the ceremony began. "I always knew you deserved better than what my son offered you." "Thank you for saying that," Claire said, genuinely moved, "and thank you for still being here, even now." "You were always more than just his wife to me," Margaret said simply. "You were someone I respected in your own right. That doesn't change just because the marriage ended." The ceremony itself was small and simple, exactly as Claire had wanted it. Ethan stood waiting at the end of a short garden path lined with soft white flowers, his eyes bright with quiet emotion as Claire walked toward him, no anxious performance in her steps, only steady, grounded joy. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, simple promises built on honesty rather than grand declarations meant to impress an audience. Ethan spoke of steadiness, of choosing her not just in moments of excitement but in the quiet, ordinary days that made up the majority of a life. Claire spoke of growth, of how losing everything she once thought she needed had taught her what she actually valued, and how grateful she was to have found someone who valued the same things. By the time they exchanged rings, there wasn't a dry eye among the small gathering, and Claire felt, standing there in the golden afternoon light, with Ethan's hand steady in hers, a completeness she had never quite achieved during even the happiest moments of her first marriage. The reception that followed was modest but full of genuine warmth, laughter carrying easily across the garden as friends and family mingled beneath strings of soft lights Ethan had hung himself the day before. Claire moved through the gathering with an ease that surprised even her, greeting guests, laughing freely, entirely present in a moment she had once feared she might never reach. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and most of the guests had said their goodbyes, Claire found herself alone for a few quiet minutes on the porch, watching the last of the string lights flicker gently in the evening breeze. Ethan joined her a few minutes later, 2 glasses of wine in hand, settling into the chair beside her. "Happy?" he asked, handing her a glass. "More than I ever thought possible," Claire said honestly. "It's strange, looking back. If you had told me 2 years ago that losing my marriage would eventually lead me here, to this exact moment, I don't think I would have believed you." "Sometimes the hardest chapters end up writing the best parts of the story," Ethan said, echoing, without realizing it, words Grace had once offered Claire during those early difficult months. "I used to think my life fell apart that night on the stairs," Claire said, looking out at the quiet garden she had planted with her own hands. "Now I think that was actually the night it finally started making sense." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the soft sounds of the evening settling around them, content simply to exist together, without needing conversation to fill every quiet moment. In the years that followed, Claire's design career continued to flourish, eventually leading her to open a small studio of her own, one built on the same principles of honesty and craftsmanship that Ethan brought to his own woodworking. Grace remained a constant, steady presence in her life, their bond only strengthened by everything they had weathered together. Claire never fully forgot the pain of that first betrayal, nor did she pretend it hadn't shaped her in lasting ways. But she carried the memory differently now, not as an open wound, but as a marker of transformation, proof of exactly how much strength had been hiding inside her all along, waiting patiently for the right moment to reveal itself. She thought, occasionally, of the woman she had been on that first terrible night, sitting frozen on the stairs with a crumpled receipt in her fist, certain her entire world had ended. She wished, sometimes, that she could reach back through time and offer that woman some quiet reassurance, some small promise, that the devastation she felt in that moment would eventually give way to something far stronger and far more genuinely hers than anything she had lost. But perhaps, Claire reasoned, some lessons could only be learned by living through them fully, by feeling every ounce of pain and uncertainty before finally emerging, steady and whole, on the other side. She had not simply rebuilt her life after Daniel left. She had built something entirely new, something that belonged fully and completely to her, brick by careful brick, choice by deliberate choice, until the woman who once sat broken on those stairs had transformed into someone she barely recognized, in the very best possible way. And every single morning she woke beside Ethan, in the home they had built together, surrounded by the quiet, steady happiness she had once feared she might never find again. Claire felt nothing but gratitude for the difficult, painful path that had ultimately led her exactly where she was always meant to be. Her story had not ended the night Daniel walked out the door. It had only just begun.